I'd like to give Pam a chance first, if there's anything you want to say to start us, since you've already had responses while people think of their questions. I'd like to thank Giuliana, who I hope can still hear me, right? I think so. She's still online. And Roberta for these very thoughtful and careful readings. I mean, I think I agree with you, Roberta, on I think the point about temporal excess and temporality is something that I would like to develop further. And I did leave out also some words that are in the paper, the written paper, about especially the ways that the colonized understood their experience in terms of time. And, you know, it was such a kind of colonizer heavy paper, but I think it's important to really take account, right, of the colonized experience of fascist imperialism. And sometimes those bodies of work are very distinct from the historiography on fascist empire and so on. And so, I mean, that's just something as I think about going forward with this kind of argument, I think I need to take more account of. But thank you to both of you. Okay, the mic is in the back.
Hello, thank you for these presentations. Definitely a lot of fruitful and robust thought here that I think I'll be reflecting on for some time. I wanted to take this question of excess in a kind of a slightly tangential direction. One of the thoughts that occurred to me during these presentations, especially during Pam's, was thinking about sort of, you know, one of the motivating factors for fascisms, in particular Japanese, German, and Italian fascisms, which were the subject of Pam's presentation. Thinking about one of the motivations behind the emergence of these kinds of politics that we're labeling as fascist, being the need for access to colonial resources, right? And connected to colonies and resource extraction, raw material resources, is industrial development and modernity, and naval and other forms of military preparedness, right? In a zero-sum kind of global order in which access to imperial territories is intimately connected to industrial development and industrial modernity, and therefore military power and the expression of broader forms of power in the world. In each of these three cases, Italy, Germany, and Japan, each of those countries had come late to the game of industrialization, and also, connected to that, late to the game of imperial expansionism, and expressed in their own various ways this feeling of being shut out, right, from the world of empire and imperial expansionism. In fact, on October the 2nd, 1935, right here in Palazzo Venezia, the night before the invasion of Ethiopia, Mussolini expressed this view, right, that the rich colonial booty of others had been taken by the great powers, by France, by Britain, by the United States, and only left crumbs for Italy and other emergent nations like this, right, to feast upon. And I wonder if we might think about, and again, I'm kind of moving just to the side of the point of your talk, Pam, in wanting to think through motivations for fascism. I wonder if anyone has any comments as to empire and excess of empire as a motivating factor for the formation of fascist politics in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Federico, Molly, and Paul after that.
Small comment. I have a small comment. I really like this panel, and it's great to see how integrated all the comments were and how one can have a kind of broader picture of a state of a field. So this is really an opportunity for learning. So thank you. I have a small comment that when Pamela, you refer to the apparent contradiction of Japan being in a way under the threat of empire and eventually becoming imperialist itself. Now, what is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is a clear limitation of the Mosse approach, I mean, which is Eurocentrism, is clearly corrected once one goes outside of Europe, because what is an apparent contradiction actually is not. I mean, in Latin America, people were extremely critical, especially of what they, in a fascist way, call plutocratic empires. I mean, they were anti-imperialists, clearly so, the same in India, and the same in many other places. And at the same time, they were, 100% fascist, because they say so, and our task as historians is to understand what they mean first, rather than imposing definitions. And second, they saw no contradiction. So we see the contradiction. They don't. And I don't think we should be arbiters of what they think, but trying to understand why ideas that to many of us look pretty idiotic made a lot of sense to them. I mean, that's the task of the historian. So, I mean, this is great. I mean, and I really appreciate that you provided a kind of global picture outside of the limitations of an extreme kind of binary focus on Germany and Italy. I mean, the more we see other places, the more you understand the center, I think. So thank you. So it's a comment, not a question, but thank you.
Molly and then Paul.
I guess my question is somewhat of a follow-up or my comment. To what extent, as you survey this, do you see expansion, territorial expansion, as something that is inherent in fascist regimes? Is this only a particularity of these three relatively industrialized, aspiring regimes in the interwar period that for economic, demographic reasons of ideology and social stability tried to expand? Or are there other examples in that period of fascist regimes that were content to just transform themselves? And how you come down on this, what does this say about right radical, populist, post-fascist, late fascist, choose your term, movements and regimes now? Is a distinctive difference that they don't seem to want to expand? Perhaps economically much more like Stephen Gross's export empire, which is, I think, a useful model to think of than military expansion. You know, people often used to say about Donald Trump, well, he can't be a fascist. Look, he doesn't want to expand. We may want to rethink that in light of his current claims making on Greenland, Panama, and perhaps Canada economically, or who knows what.
Thanks for such a wonderful panel. I have two questions. The first is there a relationship between fascist war making and fascist empire? I mean, there's a whole lot of literature that says that the brutality of Nazi occupation in Ukraine and Nazi empire in Ukraine is related to the way they fought the war against the Soviet Union. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, is there a comparative argument to be made about military practice? And the second, you know, Pam, in our field, there's a kind of an argument that the successor states in Eastern Europe after World War I were kind of mini empires. And I guess I'm wondering, how far would you sort of take that metaphor and apply it to a place like, well, you mentioned it in your initial, Ustasha, Croatia. Is that a fascist empire? They didn't build infrastructure, they didn't have time, but they certainly managed populations and suppressed, you know, insurgencies.
All right, thank you everyone for these great and also very challenging questions and comments. So a lot to think about. I mean, I think, you know, there's a number of questions about sort of origins or, you know, does empire drive fascism? Does violence inhere in fascist imperialism? Right? There's a number of different ways that people ask things. The role of industrialization. I mean, if we take seriously people like Padmore that Giuliana talks about, you know, then we have to think about the ways in which, you know, empire generates the conditions for fascism, right? It's a precondition for fascism, and yet there's many other empires that don't actually develop fascism, right? So I think, I mean, I really don't have the answer to some of these questions. I think many of these questions actually, to me, start to point towards the differences between these three cases, which I didn't focus on in my talk. And, you know, thinking about the role of warfare and you know, genocidal violence and so on. I mean, certainly, I think, I mean, I agree and thank Federico for his comment that once we start to broaden our frame, whether it's to include more fascisms in that historical moment, especially outside of Europe, or to think just more broadly about fascism, then we really start to see, you know, the ways in which these projects can entertain what appears to be contradictory ideas, as Federico said, which have often led to a kind of dismissiveness about the irrationality or inefficiency of these experiments, right? So I think about the Italian fascist regime, which is always fascist empire, which is often portrayed as economically irrational, right? And yet within a logic of fascist empire, it's completely coherent, right? And I think that if we broaden our frame too, then we have to stop thinking about these normative assumptions by which we consider, someone in Latin America who's an anti-imperialist but is also a fascist in that particular context, right, as somehow having contradictory consciousness or not being irrational or not understanding. I do think so. For example, to go to Paul's question, I don't know. I don't think that the Ustasha had a kind of mini empire. I mean, we see, and again, this gets back to the more fundamental definitional debates that Roberta kind of ended upon about, ultimately how do we define fascism and then fascist imperialism? Because, I mean, I'm including the Ustasha here as a fascist movement. It's genocidal logic, and I mean, there's many traits in the fascist minimum, but it seems to me quite different from the cases I talked about here. But perhaps, Pavelic and the NDH just didn't have enough time, right? They didn't have enough power, right? They were very constrained by the events with what they could actually do and what they could realize. But unfortunately, they realized, genocidal violence very quickly. But I'm not sure that the vision was a kind of mini empire in the Balkans, or the same, for Codranu, for example. And so, I mean, I think the lesson, to go to Molly's point or question, is that, I mean, then and now we see these very transnational conversations, right, happening, and the transfer of practices and ideas, right? So that, I mean, Pavelic, is protected by Mussolini, then interned by Mussolini, then turned back into Dalmatia by Mussolini. And so, I mean, I think we see the importance of the transnational fascist framework then and now. I'm still a bit hesitant, going back to the discussion yesterday about transhistorical versus transnational. But certainly, I think there is a lesson for today's far-right movements that are in these transnational conversations where they are exchanging strategies, ideas, symbols, and they're drawing upon one another's historical experiences. And, it is interesting to see that suddenly Trump is using this kind of imperialist language, right? That was not part of his first campaign or, first administration. And it's hard to understand what, again, the logic is behind that. But of course, to go back to what I just said about Federico's point, it's so easy to dismiss these things as crazy or irrational. And yet they are possessed of a logic, right? It's just one that is so different to liberal norms. And unfortunately, we have to take it seriously. And so I don't know what that territorializing move in the contemporary rhetoric means, but it's certainly worrisome. I don't think it's just a joke, right, on the part of Trump and his supporters. So I know I probably haven't done justice to all these wonderful comments and questions, but Roberta.
Well, I will just add that, it's not just the fascists in Latin America and India that were anti-imperialists. Also the fascists in Italy were anti-imperialists when it came to Italians living under, foreign rule still elsewhere. So in that sense, that combination of being anti-imperialist and yet pursuing expansion is not something that is only true of fascists outside of Europe. When it comes to territorial expansion as a key, as a key characteristics of these regimes. I mean, I think that is absolutely the case. But here we actually have three regimes that we can compare, study, compare, and really look at what is it that they do when they are in power. And then once they are in power, the desire to expand and the desire to pursue a particular kind of expansion, I think, is true of all of them. I think it's hard to make some claims about the imperial dreams about movements that never got to that stage and what it is that these empires did. I mean, I think it's already quite a challenge to compare these three. I think it's absolutely essential and necessary, but I think it would be sort of difficult to have a conversation about what it is that fascist Italy did in the empire with what goals Romanian fascists had, right? So I think that's a bit difficult to achieve. Just
Okay,
as I
okay.
think.
Oops, oh, sorry.
Oh,
Roberta.
sorry. Which then brings me to fascists then and now, and here I want to sort of go back to something you brought up, and that is our role as teachers and what it is we tell to our students, right? I mean, when I have to explain fascism to my students, I talk about militarism, I talk about grievances, I talk about uniforms, I talk about expansion, I talk about dictatorship, and I talk about war, and then sort of well, what about Trump, right? Does he look like a fascist? And given the description that I gave of Mussolini, they do not instantly see a connection to the present. And on the one hand, that is understandable and right. On the other hand, it's my task to help them see linkages and connection, and to help them see what the legacies are, what the afterlives are, but there are also clear differences. And I think expansion was one of those. And now I'm not quite sure where we're going to go with this, because things are developing quickly, changing quickly. And then, before it was just like, well, this sense of isolationism, entrenchment, and so forth is something very different, but maybe not anymore.
Okay, wait, no, wait, we have to. There are people in the back who are going to hurt me if we don't.
Yeah, so thanks, Pam, Roberta, Giuliana, we miss you. I like this panel a lot because I think it kind of points us back to the conditions, the constraints, otherwise the context of fascism, to which I think we came close last night with the question that Sven posed of Enzo. And so I want to see if I can kind of push us there too with a comment, a question that I kind of claim or flagged, which I want to return tomorrow when I speak about visions of world order. So first, the claim that I'd like to make tomorrow about autarky and perhaps too about isolationism is that it's sort of meaningless, right? Unless we talk or we, without the adjectives that often preceded it, at least in the mouths of the Italians, and that is minimum or maximum autarky, or the other meaning of autarky, right, which is autonomy. That is autonomy within the world order as it was. Now, that's the claim. Now, the comment, which I think is more important for the purposes of this panel, is I think about the fourth meaning of excess there, and that is, I guess, with all, or maybe it's more of a concern than a comment, with all of this kind of focus on the modernity of fascism, I feel, and I'm afraid we sort of neglect or we forget the fact that with these two or three countries here in Italy, Germany, Japan, if we compare them with the British, French, not to mention the American empires in terms of GDP, we're talking about three countries that we would compare to maybe Iran or North Korea. in our own time. And so that's the comment there. And then the question. So this is a kind of contention as a question, and that is that Italy, Germany, and Japan did not come into a world of empires, but a world of one empire, and that is the empire of the United States. And so I wonder, or evermore a world of one empire, which was the world of the United States after the First World War. And so the question, I guess, here is if we can speak about fascism without this context of the world order in general and the world order in particular of the United States, insofar as it was that reaction, that struggle within that order, which provided the force for the sort of bid for new order among these three countries.
Okay, Atina has been waiting a long time, and she's all the way in the front.
No, I just wanted to sort of return to a point that Giuliana made about the contingent nature of the conversations at Stanford in 1963, which I thought was so striking because it felt like yesterday we had sort of ended with this view that, well, when they were talking in 1963 at Stanford or at Hoover, in fact, right, not to forget, that they were talking about something that they thought was past. And Giuliana reminded us, very usefully, thank you, I wish you were here too, that in fact there was, there were multiple post-colonial or decolonizing, violent conflicts going on throughout, obviously, the 50s and 60s. And in fact, right at the time of their meeting, and that just also reminded me of, the links that we are, I think, so frequently drawing between Algeria, in particular, right, and discussions of fascism in post-war Europe, and all of that is happening indeed in the late 50s and the 60s, and so I'm just curious what sort of, and I guess what everyone in the room thinks about that connection, which we haven't made at all, that really when they met, they could not have, were they that blinkered? Well, it's a question, especially in relationship to France, for example, that this was completely out of their range. So that was one point I thought that was just really worth raising. The second point is that she returned us to the issue that Andy brought up right at the beginning about the important connection of thinking about fascism and anti-fascism, and that really the minute, and then the minute we start thinking about legacies of anti-fascism, we immediately have to go into the discussion of racism and anti-colonialism. It's just like right out there, and Giuliana, made that connection for us, which then just brings me just to the third observation, which for those of us, Pamela, you sidestepped this so, carefully by saying, well, I don't want to get into the, catechism debate, and Dirk isn't here, et cetera, et cetera. But that it's just so striking to me that we are sitting here very calmly, right, having a conversation about the connections between imperialism and fascism, right? And nobody is freaking out, nobody's calling anybody an anti-Semite, nothing dramatic is happening. And in fact, right? Yeah, there's tomorrow. And, and the day after. But I'm just, I'm wondering, like, it's not just a historiographical time lag, right? But it's also the nature of the way we've entered the conversation, that we're talking, we enter through Italy, we enter through fascism, not through Nazism. What is it about fascism that makes it easier for us to talk about, imperialism and empire? It's just sort of me sitting here being just really kind of, wow, this is so different. And I'm very grateful.
Hello. Well, thanks very much for this wonderful paper and the two comments. I just wanted to add on this debate on the relation between fascism and, let us say, fascist imperialism, Germany, Japan, and Italian fascism, that one dimension, and this is related with the research project I'm conducting with the group of Evasionists and Europeanists, historians, on the political dimension of the construction of these empires by Germany, by fascist Italy, and by Japan. And one way to look at it is to look at the type of political regimes, of political administration they promote and organize. Manchukuo, of course, is a typical example, but we have Burma, we have the Philippines, we have Albania. The design of the political institutions of Albania by Italian fascism is, in a way, a very interesting dimension of how fascist Italy wants to design these institutions. The same happens, although with a much more complicated, because of this polyocratic dimension of National Socialism in terms of the administration of the occupied countries and also of the political expansion of Nazi imperialism in the East. But let's look at Slovakia, let's look at Croatia. What type of political institutions do they create? What kind of political regimes they create when they are not under direct, typical colonial administration, military administration in these empires? So I think there is a lot of comparisons to be done in this dimension of, of political institutions, not just corporatism. Corporatism was, of course, a very interesting element, as a matter of fact, unifying Italian fascism with Japan. But this kind of political institutions and administration of these fascist empires.
Renato, you were next.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting panel. I have a question for Pamela, for all the panel. I'm afraid that I will complicate it, in a certain sense, more things already so complicated. My question is strictly related to this last point. There is a fact in Italian colonialism, fascist colonialism, that is not very well known, but is very interesting. An Italian historian of Italian colonialism, Luigi Golia, wrote a very good essay on it. Everybody knows that fascists had its youth organization. But there was a fascist youth organization also for the colonies. A lictors' youth for Eritrea and then Ethiopia, and an Arab lictors' youth for Libya. So, yes. So my question is, did the Japanese have something like this? Had them? Probably no. My question is this, and if they had not, does this imply that one of the features of the fascist imperialism is once again a totalitarian aspiration? Because it is a very interesting, this attempting forming at a lower level, of course, but forming participants to a new civilization. Of course, this contrasted with time with a racist implication of fascist policy, but nonetheless, it's very interesting.
I believe we have 4 minutes left. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. All right. One more question?
One more question.
Do you want to take one more?
Where?
Right over here.
Okay.
So thank you so much for these very thought-provoking talks. I have a question to the panel at large about imperial leftovers in the former colonies now. I'm specifically thinking about fascist-built environment in East Africa, but I think this could apply to a couple of different world regions. Specifically, I'm thinking of different approaches taken in, for example, Asmara, where there's an intense drive for preservation. For example, the Cultural Assets Rehabilitation Project, and then the bid for UNESCO heritage status. Compared with, say, Addis Ababa, where things have been raised or recycled, you might say, so fully refurbished as to be unrecognizable. And there's been some debate about what accounts for those different approaches. Mia Fuller suggested that we should look to politics in East Africa after 1941, specifically Eritrea's post-colonial nostalgia and the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ruthie Yobbs pointed to practical issues, national budgets and their priorities. I sometimes wonder if the answer is as simple as what went up where Asmara got Art Deco and futurism that many people enjoy today, whereas Addis Ababa got some very heavy-handed rationalism that, frankly, can be pretty unpleasant. So I'm curious what the panelists think.
Okay, Pam, you get the final word.
Okay, gosh, so many things to say. For Robert, in terms of autarky, I mean, autarky, as we know from Tara Zahra and other people's work, wasn't unique to fascist states. I think it goes back to something Roberta said in her comment about autarky, settler colonialism, which is also not unique. Corporativism, it's the kind of combination, right? The intersection of these things maybe that really distinguishes fascist imperialism. And I mean, I would disagree with you about the US as the hegemon. I mean, France, Britain, like if I had done a different kind of paper thinking about Italy in the context of French and British imperialism, I mean, there's all kinds of competition and transfer and so on. And also, I mean, I think we have to take seriously the ways in which juridical concepts and statuses inherited from the Ottomans and from the Habsburgs in territories that Italy took over also influenced. So I think there's a whole world of empires, past and present, that are relevant for the Italian case at least. Atina, I mean, that's why in my book I called Italy's decolonization a long decolonization. It's still going on. Basically, just concluded formally when the 1963 seminar happens, and then there's all these other decolonization moments. So, yeah, as for the blinkeredness of the participants, I'm not sure, but I think it's especially when we think about Algeria, but of course there's a lot of work on the blindness of people who had been victims of the Nazis. Who go to Algeria and can't come to terms, right, with the torture and so on. Political administration, also I think, yes, there's much work to be done. Political institutions and administrations, just in Italy alone, as I suggested, there's such a variety across the landscape, which has to do with the different statuses of the territories, whether you're a protectorate or a formal colony, whether you're European or African. I think that although there are like youth groups in all of these situations, or most of these situations, that the political structures are different. There are certain fascist implementations, but the ability of the state to go to Renato's point, to construct a totalitarian model is extremely hampered, especially in places like Ethiopia and Somalia, hampered by time, by geography, and so on. It's more successful in a place, I think, like Rhodes, but less successful on an island like Kalymnos, right? So again, the geographies, I think, really matter here, and the unevenness of the terrain and the political institutions. I don't know about the Japanese. As for Diana, I actually wonder if in East Africa, I do think the period of British military administration has not been studied sufficiently, and for the impact of that upon Eritrea and Ethiopia, and that may impact questions about preservation and colonial heritage and having had this kind of intermediate placeholder power, because there were only parts of Ethiopia that were the reserved areas that were under the British, and Haile Selassie was in control of most of Ethiopia by 42, as opposed to Eritrea. So I think the BMA may also be a factor in the story. And just one other thing that I wanted to say is that I'm very interested in conceptualizations of land and sea and the nexus between land and sea. And in this instance, I think that Japan and Italy have much more in common than Germany, that when we start to really unpack how they're thinking about space and land and sea, and this goes to Brian's point also about military power, whether they're thinking about naval power versus, armed armies and so on, that there the differences emerge. But I think that they are probably productive to unpack further. So
Let's thank our panelists.